All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 3, Section 3, English Settlements in America. Of all the sections in Chapter 3, this is the most important one. That is because we'll be talking in much greater detail about the English colonies. And of course, the English colonies are important because it's those colonies that end up becoming the United States. We're also given a really good map here to help us show exactly where all these countries are located and where their colonial areas are. So the green represents France or New France. We can see the French and their capital city here, Quebec, would be located right there. There's also the St. Lawrence River. Maybe we'll do some blue here. A river here in eastern Canada that the French explored down. And last section, we had mentioned that the French had done more than any other colony to really penetrate the interior. And so you can see that the French had occupied the interior of North America here, making their way as far down as the Great Lakes and eventually to the Mississippi River. Meanwhile, we can also see the Dutch. The Dutch have a presence here in New Netherlands. This is modern day New York. Pretty small presence comparatively, but do recall that the Dutch settlement was pretty low in terms of population. Spain, oops, not Florida, but Spain in the orange. You see their presence here in Florida. The Spanish fortification of St. Augustine would be somewhere right here. And again, the purpose of Spanish Florida was to create a type of military barrier so that any efforts by the English or any other countries to try and pirate Spanish silver, which was making all the money down here, the Spanish could thwart it, right? And that was the purpose for Spanish Florida. And lastly, in the yellow, we have the English. Now, while the English will come to occupy all of this area that we see here, the very first English colonies were along the Chesapeake Bay and New England. And so we might say these were the first English colonies. They'll go on to create more, but we're going to focus on the earliest ones. And one thing that made England, or actually let's point out where that is. So the Chesapeake Bay is this body of water right in here. So up into this bay right here. And New England, generally speaking, is this area right up here by Massachusetts. You could see Plymouth, the Massachusetts Bay. That's where the New England colonies are located. But one thing that made England different than their French, Dutch, and Spanish counterparts was just the sheer number of people the English sent to the New World when compared, sometimes described as the swarms of English. So we might write about there that England sent the most people to the New World. And that is one thing that is sent the most people, we'll say, to New World. One thing that makes England unique and explains a little bit about their colonization. Now, England also, of the English colonies, there's much more diversity between the English colonies, or at least we're to be looking at the English colonies in enough detail that we can make distinctions between the Chesapeake colonies, the colonies around the Chesapeake Bay, and the New England colonies. Now, some of this is review, so we don't really have to spend too much time on it, but do recall that the Chesapeake colonies of Virginia and Maryland, so Virginia and Maryland are Chesapeake colonies located around the Chesapeake Bay. If you're curious, Jamestown, which was the first permanent English colony, Jamestown becomes Virginia. So we're talking about the same area there. And those colonies were founded for commercial orientation. That means they were founded to make money, and we covered that last chapter. However, what we didn't talk about was the demographics, and that was because they were commercially oriented, that those colonies had few women. When compared to the New England colonies, which were established for religious motives, recall the Pilgrims and Puritans wanting to create holy communities, they tended to move more so with families and children. So maybe one comparison that we can make between these two colonies is in the area of demographics. right? Demographics. And demographics is just a fancy word for population, right? Population. So the Chesapeake colonies, Virginia and Maryland, fewer women. New England colonies, they tended to move with families, men, women, children, elderly, a little bit more diverse. We're mostly talking about in these Chesapeake colonies, it's mostly young men who move there in order to provide labor. Now, an event that puts English colonization on hold breaks out in the 1640s, and that's the English Civil War. Now, if you were studying English history, you'd go into much more detail about what this was. But for the purposes of its impact on the New World, really all we need to know about the English Civil War is that it puts English colonization on pause, right? It puts it on pause. That focus on the New World is, it doesn't matter anymore because back at home in England, people are literally killing each other. The English king at the time, King Charles I, he is the English king, goes to war with the parliamentarians. We'll talk a little bit about English politics, but pretty much in England, there is a monarch. The monarch is either a king or queen. We talked about Henry VIII, Elizabeth I. At this time, it's Charles I. But there also is a group called the Parliament. Right? And the Parliament is a group of nobles, all right, a group of nobles. The monarch is the king or queen. And pretty much all you need to know is that these are two sources of authority. So the king has power, the queen has power, but Parliament also has power. And pretty much a lot of English history is the conflict between these two groups. Who really holds the true authority? And so in this case, the royalists, who are those who are loyal to the king, went to war with the parliamentarians. It was about things like finances, like taxes, but there was also a religious element to it. And that is the king or the monarch represented the Church of England. So we might say of the Church of England, this was a royalist position. And Puritanism was much more favored by the Parliament, right? Much more favored by the Parliament. Again, this has to do a little bit with the ideas surrounding the Protestant Reformation and religious belief. How much do you defer to authority? Recall that the Church of England, while it did break away from the Catholic Church, it simply replaced the Pope with a king. And the Puritans themselves said, that's really not good enough. You have to do more to get rid of church authority. So there was some religious element to it, but at the end of the day, I think it was Charles I attempting to raise taxes without Parliament's consent. Either way, the English Civil War was won by the parliamentarians. In fact, King Charles I himself was executed. He was beheaded, executed by Parliament. And for 20 years, England attempted to run a government without a king. It ended up being chaos, a disaster. It didn't work. And in 1660, England restored the monarch. Right? This is sometimes called the Restoration in England. In short, ruling without a king didn't work. In 1660, the son of the beheaded Charles I was asked to resume the throne, become king again. And it was only after restoration that colonization picked up again, right? Again, the point for us here that we want to make note of is that when this happened between 1640 and 1660, it put English colonization on pause, right? So for about 20 years, there was, kind of just two different sections of English colonies in the New World, the Chesapeake and New England. So we'll talk about those in more detail. So in terms of the Chesapeake colonies, one way to describe them is that it was a struggle. Recall Jamestown. This is very important. Jamestown is the first permanent English colony in, we'll say, North America. In North America, in the New World. Now, the struggles of Jamestown were, there were a number of them. Recall that Jamestown was founded by a joint stock company. The purpose of a joint stock company is to make money. We talked about this last chapter. They hoped to find gold and silver, but there was no gold and silver to find. Instead, what they ran into was a very powerful Native American confederation, the Powhatan. So we might say of the Powhatan, this is an Indian, we'll just call it a tribe. We'll say powerful. The English really had hoped to kind of colonize the way that the Spanish did, just conquer, plunder, and steal. They couldn't do that because of the powerful Powhatan. And instead, it was people like John Smith who took control of the colony and forced them to work in order to survive. So John Smith was an English colonist. Helped, or really not even helped, really was one of the main causes as to why Jamestown survived. So we might say English colonists saved Jamestown. And he did it by, number one, forcing people, colonists, to work. He had a saying, those who don't work won't eat, and maintained friendly relations with the Powhatans. So maybe created friendly relations with the Powhatan, recognizing that at least at this time, the Jamestown colonists were really no match for the Powhatan India. And so it was because he forced people in his own colony to work, and then he recognized that friendly relations were necessary, the Jamestown colonies could survive. But despite its survival, the early years were especially troublesome. Some people have described Jamestown as a death trap, and that is not an exaggeration. Poor health, lack of food, fighting with the Native American population despite efforts by John Smith to maintain peaceful relations. Fighting was always a problem. In fact, things were so dire that in the winter of 1609 to 1610, the colonists resorted to cannibalism simply to survive. This was called starving time. So we might say resort to cannibalism. And that was they dug up the dead bodies of people and ate them so they could survive, just to give you an idea of how dire it was. There was questions about abandonment. It nearly happened in 1610. The colonists almost packed up all their stuff and left. However, new supply ships came with more and more colonists. Again, one of the reasons why Jamestown survives was because the English simply, and we talked about this a second ago, simply swarmed, right? The swarm of English who arrived, more and more arrived. By 1624, 7,500 people had arrived in Jamestown. Only 1,200 had survived. So a very high death rate, right? High death rate. And so all of this, right? All of this was a problem for the Virginia Company. Remember, the Virginia Company was the company that created Jamestown. It was supposed to make money, but they couldn't even survive, right? So the last thing really on these people's minds anyways was making money. And so there were some reforms and some changes that took place in order to try and make Jamestown survive as a colony for a long period of time, but also to make money. And the most important thing that the Jamestown colonists discovered was tobacco. By far, tobacco saved the colony. Tobacco saved Jamestown because this was something that could make money. So even though it wasn't gold and silver, what initially the very first colonists envisioned as being a way to make money, growing tobacco in Jamestown and then selling it to England was a way that the company could make some profit and a reason to stay there. The problem, or one of the big problems, is that tobacco requires labor. Now, unlike the Spanish, the English simply couldn't force the natives to do it. They were not strong enough. And so instead, Virginia, the Virginia Company, which later on becomes, or sorry, Jamestown, which later on becomes just simply Virginia, tries to pass some various reforms in order to draw more colonists there. The question is, with such a high death rate, how to get more people to move to Jamestown? One is by giving people of Jamestown democratic power. And so the House of Burgesses is set up. The House of Burgesses is the first representative government in the New World. And this is established, I'm going to guess here, 1617, I'll say. It's early in the 1600s. I don't know if that date is 100% correct. But it's the first representative government in the New World. In other words, what the Virginia colony is saying is that if you move here, we'll let you have some sort of government power. And this becomes very important in the kind of history of how the colonies become the United States, because one thing that separates England is a long history and tradition of self-government. In other words, in places like Virginia, those colonists had been making their own political decisions for over 100 years before the American Revolution happened. So that's sort of an important important point to take note of. What's interesting, though, is that the reason why the House of Burgesses was created was not because it was seen as a progressive form of enlightened government. It was simply an effort to try and draw more people to a part of the world where anyone who got there pretty much died. So certainly take note of the House of Burgesses. Additionally, there were also other colonies that were set up around the area. Maryland is another good example. The interesting thing about Maryland is that it initially was created as a refuge for English Catholics. So we might say of English Catholics, they could find refuge in Maryland. Lord Baltimore, he established or created, we'll say founded, the Maryland colony. And so the idea was that when Elizabeth I made England a Protestant nation, there were still some Catholics there, and they didn't want to convert, and they weren't really welcome at home. So Lord Baltimore said, look, if you're a persecuted English Catholic, let's create Maryland, and you can go to Maryland and you'll enjoy not only freedom from religious persecution, in fact, we will end up persecuting the Protestants. What ended up happening, however, is that mostly English Protestants moved to Maryland, and instead of being a colony founded on religious reasons, it gravitated much more so towards the growth of tobacco and producing money economically. So at the end of the day, we might say that even though Maryland was initially created as a refuge for English Catholics, that Maryland, we'll say Maryland and Virginia produced tobacco, and that became their primary really goal and how they fit into the English Empire. Now, in terms of who provided the labor for the tobacco, it was indentured servants, right? And an indentured servant is in some ways like a contractual slave. So that's what we'll call it, a contractual slave. And so the way that indentured servants arrived to the New World is that they would sign a contract with the landowner. They would agree to work for 5 or 7 years. So 5 to 7 years, this is the typical, we'll say term, a servant was required to work. Required to work. So unlike slaves, which never became free, slavery was a lifetime condition, what made servants different was that they were only enslaved for 5 to 7 years. After that time period was over, they were then free. And the hope was that they would get their own land. Most indentured servants were young men from England or Englishmen. It wasn't exclusively that. There were some African indentured servants, Native American indentured servants, but mostly men from England. In return, what the servant got or received was the passage to America. So the landowner paid the trip to, say, America. All right, so that was the exchange. So essentially, what did it cost to get a ticket to the New World? Well, it costs 5 to 7 years of your life working on the tobacco plantations. But, afterwards, there was hope that one would accumulate or attain land. That did happen in some cases. In some cases, indentured servants never obtained land. In most cases, indentured servants died before the 5 to 7 years were up because the health conditions and disease and food conditions there were just so terrible. But this had an impact on shaping colonial society, coupled with another reform to try and draw more settlers or more people to the colony. So both of the House of Burgesses, maybe we'll make a little yellow star here, and the headright system, these were both reforms to try and get more people into Jamestown because more people meant more tobacco. The headright system, this was a system that gave land to people who came to Virginia or paid for someone to come to Virginia. All right, so they were giving land away to people who could pay for other people to arrive. So really the way that this worked, and we can illustrate it here really quickly, is that in Virginia, you had this class of landowners. We'll put a fancy hat on him here, right? He has a plot of land, and then back. So this is Virginia, right? Virginia. This is England. A lot of poor people in England, they just got kicked off their land. They're roaming the cities sort of homeless. The New World sounds like an attractive place to go, but they don't have enough money to get there. And so the way that the headright system works is that this person over here, the landowner, pays for this guy to come over. He becomes an indentured servant. He agrees that he will work on this piece of land for 5 to 7 years. And after that time is up, he'll go on and, hopefully be a landowner himself. But because of the headright system, because this person paid for a person to come over, he gets another plot of land. And because he has more land, now he needs another indentured servant to come over. And so now he pays for another person, and then he gets another plot of land, right? And so what ends up happening is that Jamestown and Virginia more broadly ends up dividing themselves into two major classes. One are the landowners, right? We'll call them the owners. And they own an enormous amount of land thanks to this headright system. And then you have the servants. Another way of putting it is that there are people who paid for their own way across and people who were paid for. So it creates this class system, right, in Jamestown that ends up having very violent consequences. And those consequences eventually spill over to change and alter the, we'll get to in a second, change and alter the Virginia colony. Now, another thing that's true about the existence of Jamestown and later on Virginia are the wars that the Anglos or the English fight with the local Powhatan. Anglo, if you're not familiar with this, Anglo just means English. It's not the language, though. It's like the English ethnicity, the English culture. So Anglo-Powhatan Wars just simply means wars between the Powhatan Indians and the English. There were 3 wars in total. The first war is where Pocahontas, who was the daughter to the Powhatan chief. See her pictured here. Pocahontas was responsible for maintaining peace between the settlers and the Powhatan Indians in this first conflict. So, daughter to Powhatan chief, we'll just say made peace. She converted to Christianity, married an Englishman, John Rolfe. We'll call her Pocahontas' husband. And served as a mediator, really between the colonists and Powhatans. She later on moved to England. She died of smallpox, and after that, the settlers continued to have conflicts and wars with the Powhatan Indians. The last of these conflicts, the Third Powhatan War, 1644 to 1646, did result in a settler victory or an English victory. And really, after that point, the threat of Jamestown or Virginia's existence was really put off to the side. There wasn't a question after the English victory or the settler victory if the colony would survive. Very early on, there were questions about whether or not the colony would survive. So like I mentioned before, this division of class between your landowners and your servants would have violent consequences. And that consequence was Bacon's rebellion in 1676. And Bacon's rebellion has a part to play in this transition in the Chesapeake and later on all of the southern colonies, in the English colonies. And that is the rise of slavery, specifically African slavery, and the transition from indentured servitude to slavery. So this is an important point to take note of. Now, we already talked about in previous chapters how slavery arrived in the New World, that it was African slavery in particular was already in the Caribbean and West Indies. Islands like Barbados and Jamaica, these were English islands, but that it was growing of sugar and that slavery had changed when it came to the New World in some important ways. Slaves became chattel. Recall that chattel means property. That was different than the way that slavery was typically practiced in Africa at the time and other places around the world. Slaves were also most likely servants, whereas in the New World, they were mostly dedicated to producing cash crops. And that slavery in the New World became based off of race. It was almost exclusively African, especially as you got further and further into the 1700s. So we might say that it was based off of race. 1619 is an important year because that was the first African slaves arrived in Jamestown. That was the year. And again, not directly from Africa, but from the Caribbean, right? That African slavery arrives in the English colonies of North America via the Caribbean, which had already had sugar plantations and African slavery there. So how does Bacon's rebellion factor into this? Well, Bacon's rebellion is a rebellion between the servants, led by Nathaniel Bacon, and William Berkeley, the governor of Jamestown, who represents the landowners. Now, essentially, you have your landowners with the fancy hat, you have your servants, and then you have also Native Americans. And so the conditions that gave rise to Bacon's rebellion initially was a conflict between the natives, we might say Indians, and the servants, particularly over land. Nathaniel Bacon essentially wanted William Berkeley to go to war with Native Americans on the Virginia frontier. So we might say that servants wanted war, and Berkeley, who represented the landowners, refused. Right? Because once these servants are done with their 5 to 7 years, they're going to go off and claim land of their own. And when they go to the outskirts of the colony, they come into contact and conflict with the native population. So they want war against the natives, Bacon does. However, Berkeley doesn't. He wants peace. He wants trading relations. He really doesn't care too much about the demands of the servants. And so Nathaniel Bacon leads a rebellion against Berkeley, chases him out, burns down Jamestown, and in the aftermath goes to war against the Native Americans himself without colonial approval. Nathaniel Bacon himself dies. Berkeley is able to assume power again. Royal troops are sent to Jamestown, and authority is restored. Bacon's rebellion ultimately fails, right, for the servants. People who were a part of it end up getting executed. However, it had an impact in the English colonies of North America because it fostered or created a catalyst for a transition from servitude to slavery. And that essentially was a fear of the servants by landowners. Essentially helped this transition because instead of relying upon servant labor, which those servants would one day be free and could cause trouble, instead there was an incentive to rely upon African labor. Now, there were other things going on at the time. So, for example, demographics were changing. So economically, it made more sense to purchase a slave rather than a servant. A slave would be purchased for life, a servant over a short period of time. Because people were living longer, slaves made more economic sense. And it was more profitable not having to, or more profitable essentially to force someone to work their entire life than only forcing someone to work for a short period of time. But this fear of the servant class, and especially this intention of trying to create a common racial category between servants and landowners, right? The racial category being English or white, was a way of protecting the landowner class. And so shortly after Bacon's rebellion in places like Virginia and other southern colonies, new laws begin to be passed, which make slavery based off racial characteristics. We might say new laws treated blacks and whites differently. In fact, new laws associated Africans with slavery and made slavery inheritable, usually through the mother. And these laws had an effect of recreating really Southern colonial society in a way that was based off of a racial system. Caste is just a social system. So we might say about Virginia and about other colonies is that by the 1700s, a racial, social, legal, economic system took root. All right, took root. And this system in Virginia eventually does spread to the other southern colonies that get founded later, the Carolina colony, the Georgia colony, the Maryland colony, etc., etc., etc. So we're going to transition here and talk about now the New England colonies. So there's a lot going on in Virginia and the development of those southern colonies. Now we're looking at the English colonies in the north. And again, some of this is going to be review from last chapter, but do recall that probably the most important group, at least early on, are the Puritans, right? The Puritans are a religious group. They want to purify the Church of England of its Catholic elements. And they tend to be much more educated than anybody else in the New World. So learned ministers, we might say they have a high level of education. High level of education. The Massachusetts Bay Colony is the Puritan. The Massachusetts Bay Colony is the Puritan colony. John Winthrop, we haven't been exposed to him before. He really is sort of like the authoritarian or dictatorial leader of the Puritan colony, right? So we might say the leader of we'll say the Massachusetts colony. And he really does rule it sort of like a king. A little bit about Puritan belief, and we'll talk more about this. But the Puritans were very, very strict. It wasn't really a fun place to live in a Puritan colony. They denounced various pastimes. They took their religious discipline very, very seriously. So any type of pleasure, dancing, singing, laughing, was associated with sin. It was associated with weakness. So not the place you want to go if you're looking for leisure. And one thing that put the Puritans really at odds with their contemporaries, especially back in England, was their insistence that God is more important than the king. And this put them at odds with other members of the Church of England who put the king as the head of the church. So we might say the insistence of God over king put the Puritans at odds with people in England. And that was one of the reasons why they were persecuted, right? Was because of their insistence that the God is more important, or God is more important than the king. But before we get to the Puritans, let's just talk a little bit about Pilgrims. This is mostly all review from last section. Remember, the Pilgrims were a much smaller group, less influential. They want complete separation, right? Not purification, but separation, right? Not purification. In other words, the Church of England can't be purified. It's too far gone. Separation. And they established the Plymouth colony, right? That is the Pilgrim colony. Mayflower is the ship that they sailed on. The Mayflower Compact is a governing document, right? It is kind of loosely, we'll just call it loosely democratic. This is a picture of the Mayflower Compact. Again, it's a document that's aged very well, considering the trajectory of the United States. But one thing we didn't talk about was the economy of some of these New England colonies. Now, one thing that we might say about, the New England economies is that, in New England, they really didn't make a lot of money, right? And it was difficult because that's not really how they were oriented. And a little bit later on, when the English Crown and the English Parliament tries to squeeze money out of its colonies, the New England colonies really aren't prepared to do that. One thing that you do find, though, in the New England colonies is that shipbuilding. And that provide a source of revenue, or at least some sort of economic benefit. So we might say of shipbuilding, we'll just write the economy next to it. But again, especially when compared to the southern colonies, which are producing tobacco, using the labor of servants, and then later on African slaves, the New England colonies really don't compare. But the Plymouth colony is not all that significant. It's relatively small. By far, the much more important colony is the Massachusetts colony, or what was called a city upon a hill. We might say this is the Massachusetts colony. And the city upon a hill is a sermon or speech given by Winthrop, or at least I think Winthrop, which really describes the purpose of creating Massachusetts and why so many Puritans lived there. And it was really to create sort of a new religious homeland. Your textbook uses this term, English Israel, right? A religious homeland. Another good way of thinking upon the city upon a hill is a religious example. The idea is that the rest of the world will look to Massachusetts as the example to follow. And so this strong religious orientation shapes the New England colonies in a way that really makes it distinct and different from the southern colonies, which again are primarily oriented towards making money. They're mostly young men that live there. It's first servants and then slaves. In New England, because of the religious orientation, there's a much stronger emphasis on literacy. In fact, literacy rates in New England are some of the highest in the world. And that's related to this emphasis on being able to read the Bible for salvation. This was something that most Protestants believed, right? Protestants believe in individual salvation. This was, in part because the Protestant Reformation was about really defying church authority, reading the Bible in the vernacular language, not in Latin, not rely upon a priest or bishop. But if you want to get to heaven, you have to be able to read the Bible yourself. And so the people that went to New England had to know how to read if they wanted to get to heaven. It also meant that there were much more there in terms of printing presses, right? Printing presses is a way to mass produce things like books. We'll just say literature, right? Literature. And so you're much more likely to find printed materials there and people who could read or write. The Puritans also believed in predestination, which we talked about previously as well. However, predestination had a profound impact. This belief had a profound impact. So once again, predestination is the belief that salvation, that means salvation means go to heaven or go to hell, is determined. Oops, ran out of them here. Oops. Salvation is determined before, let's say before birth, right? That's the idea. So if you think about it, no matter what you do as a Puritan, if you believe in predestination, no matter what you do, you're either going to heaven or you're going to hell. Most of us would think that, well, in that case, it really doesn't matter what one's actions are, right? So you could sin as much as you want, and that would have no impact on whether or not you would go to heaven or you would go to hell. But that's not really the way that the Puritans believed. For the Puritans, the question was how to know if one is saved. Right? How to know if one is saved. And that became the question. How can you tell if somebody is going to heaven or hell? And in this case, the Puritans believed that it was due to certain characteristics, right? Success was one of them. Hard work was another one. Discipline was another one. To, abstain from pleasure, right? We talked about this earlier. So if there was a person who checked off all these boxes, who was very hardworking, incredibly successful, very, very, very disciplined, abstained from any sort of physical or worldly pleasure, that was a sign that they were destined for heaven. And so this became kind of like I don't know if self-fulfilling prophecy is the proper term, but there was extreme conformity to follow all these characteristics, right? The more that you acted in this way, the better the chances were that this question would, the answer to this question would be yes, essentially. And that was the idea. However, the Puritan belief system also extended beyond individuals, right? We might say, not only this, how do we know if a person is saved, but by extension, we also might say community or town, right? How do we know if this experiment, that the city upon a hill is saved? And so it was instrumental for not only individual people to follow this in order to go to heaven, but it was important for everybody in the community and everybody in the town. Because if one person was not hardworking, was not disciplined, engaged in some sort of worldly pleasure, that could be a sign that the entire community or town was destined for hell. And so for that reason, there was very strict conformity, right? In Puritan communities, everybody had to know what everybody was doing. Very strict and strong regulation of people's sexual behavior, of their, work behavior, whatever it was. Because if somebody in your town or community or congregation or church was not abiding by these rules, that essentially could be a sign that your whole town is destined for hell. And so the Puritans were very, very strict, right, in their way, right, in their belief system. So we'll write under predestination. Maybe we'll go ahead and mark this in a different color here. We'll just say strict conformity, right? Strict conformity in Puritan communities. To be a Puritan, it was very hard. Conversion was very difficult. It required people to have a conversion narrative. The Puritans didn't really just let anybody in their church. These were the hardcore of the hardcore, right? These were people who went in a ship, traveled to the New World, endured a new environment, endured the elements, all because of their religious convictions. So they required people converting to the Puritan church to provide a narrative or a story about how they became religious or how they found God. So we might say hard to convert, right? Hard to convert. And as you might imagine, with very strict conformity, there really wasn't a lot of tolerance for other views. The Puritans were notorious for their intolerance. And there are two good specific examples that you want to be familiar with when it comes to Puritan intolerance. Roger Williams. Roger Williams was somebody who, for the most part, preached a message of religious toleration. Toleration was what Roger Williams said. That put him at odds with the congregation, with the church leaders, and eventually he was banished. Roger Williams then went on to create the colony of Rhode Island, which would serve within the English colonies as a colony for religious toleration. It really became a colony of Puritan outcasts in a lot of ways. Another great example is Anne Hutchinson, who was a woman. And she challenged the congregation, saying that they focused a little bit too much on the worldly matters and not enough on spiritual matters. Now, Anne Hutchinson was important because she wasn't just challenging the religious message that the Puritans had, but she was also upsetting the social order. When it came to the various congregations, right, guys like John Winthrop, when it came to church leaders in the Puritan community, first of all, church and state were the same, right? There was no difference between church rules and governing rules. You know, the church was the state. Church and state leaders were all men, right? All men. So women had no religious authority or political authority. And so Anne Hutchinson, who was challenging not just the spiritual message, but also challenging the social order between men and women, also found herself exiled from the Puritan community, made her way to Rhode Island, where she was eventually killed in a Indian attack. But much of the Puritan community really struggled to survive. Initially, Massachusetts Bay was the most populated colony, but as more and more people made their way over to the New World, and as England began to tighten their grip on the English colonies, the Puritans really struggled to retain their way of life. And one way that this manifested itself in the New England colonies was accusations of witchcraft. Right? Now, witchcraft wasn't uncommon at the time. 1692 is a little bit late for these accusations of witches, but this was something that occurred in Europe even before this. But the Salem witch trials of 1692 are probably the most notorious case of witchcraft accusations in the English colonies. We might say that some of the causes of this was a combination of the Puritan way of life fading. We'll talk more about how this changes. But also the threat of Indian attacks or Indian wars. The Puritans believed Native Americans to be savages, not Christian. They believed that Indians were, or Native Americans were, agents of the devil. And because of recent attacks, it was, the scapegoat then became witches. And in 1692, I believe 19 people were put to death. and the Salem witch trials, right, as a consequence of that. Now here we have a map sort of illustrating some of the colonies in New England. And in New England, we got a lot more different colonies that are different for sort of slightly religious reasons, right? So the major ones that we might want to identify, here is, most of this stuff is Massachusetts, but you could see the Rhode Island colony right here. That's Roger Williams' colony for religious toleration. The Connecticut colony over here. Could probably erase this line. The Massachusetts colony, most of this is the Massachusetts colony. Plymouth would have been sort of in this region over here somewhere, right? I don't know if this entire purple might be Plymouth. I'm not entirely sure. But the rest would be partially Massachusetts colony. There were some other smaller colonies like New Haven and stuff like that. They're all English, they're all Christian, they're all Protestant, but they just have slightly different views when it comes to kind of religious matters. So that puts them at odds. The Puritan relations with the Native Americans were sort of similar to the relationships between the Southern colonies. That's one thing that the New England and Chesapeake colonies have in common, is that they both have contentious relations with the natives. Part of that is done because of conversions, but also a lot of it is because of the fight for resources like land. Two wars in particular in this very early period, the Pequot War of 1637. This ended up being an English victory. The more serious threat was King Philip's War. King Philip is the term that the English used to describe Metacom, which was his Native American name. Metacom led a war against English colonists. And really, this was in a lot of ways, it was an English victory as well. So the English settlers did win this. Here's Metacom here, Native American name. You can see that by the 1670s, European weapons like guns were adopted. But this was really the last major threat to the English colonists. So we might say about Metacom led a war against the English colonists, last major threat to the New England colonies.